Welcome back to Justuno's video tutorials. In this series, we're going to be covering the design panel options and all the ways that you can create different designs to fit your needs. And we're going to start with the top two categories. Number one, states. How do you use them and what do they do? And number two, sizing. All the ways that you can use the sizing parameters to build out responsive designs. So let's get started. Beginning with states. Each element in your design can be stylized using this design panel on the right-hand side. Now, the state of an object or an element really refers to how that element changes when a user interacts with it on your web page. And we'll get into the definitions, but a quick example is going into a hover state and changing the canvas background to show a drop shadow. So in our default state, there's nothing there, but when I hover over it, the black drop shadow appears. Okay, so now that we've looked at an example of how to affect a design in the hover state, let's define the rest of them. The default state is in all states. If you don't change the stylizing of an element or the object in the hover or active state, the design in the default state will remain throughout all interactions. Clicking on the hover state, as we saw, any changes that you make will be reflected when the user hovers over the element. And then similarly in the active state, any changes you make on the design panel to an affected object or element will be reflected when the user clicks or presses on that element on your website. Now let's take a look at our sizing options. We have width and height, minimum width, minimum height, maximum width, and maximum height. Now, there's a lot of use cases for using any of these units of measurement, but generally when creating responsive design, we try to avoid using pixels, which are fixed units, and we try to use either percentage, viewport width or height, or auto measurements. You might notice that this canvas background is set to 80 VW, which is 80 units of the viewport width. And that will help us as we bring the scale of this down. It'll keep it at roughly 80 VW all the way down to the smaller viewports. Now, you may notice that some elements when dragged in, such as containers, have a default 100% width and auto height. And what the width does is this allows it to stretch all the way to 100% of its parent container. If we look down here, we see that this child element in orange is stretching to 100% width with auto height, while its other child element has a fixed width of 250 pixels. And you may also notice that the height is set to auto by default. And what auto does is auto wraps around the objects inside of it. Notice how if I take this container and I set it to 50 pixels, there's some overflow that could happen here. But if I set it to auto, it will wrap around the elements within it. And to take it a step further, notice that when I drag this container in, there seems to be a height setting in here, although it's set to auto and there's nothing within it. So you may wonder what that is there for. And that's what we call pseudo height. So it's really just height that's there to allow you to drop other objects in it, such as text. And once we drag that text in, you'll notice that the height squeezes down to fit right around the text inside of it. Now, the use of these responsive units of measurement also brings into play minimum and maximum width and height. So as you can see on our canvas layer, we have the width set to 80 VW. So it will shrink and it will grow at 80 VW until it hits a maximum width as set here of 700 pixels. So we can set that for the height as well. And usually in most cases, you might see a canvas with auto height. So it'll wrap around these elements and we'll set a max height of about 600 pixels. And you can do that with the minimum measurements as well by setting a limit to how small an object can shrink to. So to recap, today we covered states and sizing within the design panel. We looked at default, hover, and active states and how those can change based on the user's interaction with those elements that you've altered. And then we looked at our sizing. We looked at responsive versus fixed widths and heights. We looked at minimum and maximum widths and heights and how you can use these different parameters to create a fully responsive design to fit your needs.